Hi, my name's Dan, and this video is one in a series of videos that I'm doing about weapons for video games. So it's aimed at game designers and budding game designers, and talking about the design of weapons and the design of sets of weapons for going into your games. So if you are looking for stuff about serious stuff about real-life weapons, then, although I am talking about real-life guns in this video, this might not be for you. So what I want to do is, actually this video and the next couple of videos are in the series are pretty much trying to do a review of some subsets of weapons and some of the options that are available to you. And in this one, I particularly want to give my very simplistic look at guns and how guns developed and how guns work in a very basic fashion, so that as a games designer you have some understanding of these things. Guns fairly obviously fire projectiles, and or most of them do. And so an example, of course, is a bullet, but there are various other options: flares, rubber bullets, t-shirts. You might have come across t-shirt guns. Anything that's got a barrel and will shoot something over a distance could be thought of as a gun, regardless of what you're shooting. And in a couple of videos' time, I'll be looking at some of the more crazy kinds of fantasy guns that have been created for video games. This video is mostly rooted in the reality of guns in real life. There are other options. There are tethered projectile guns, which are also got projectiles, but they're used for firing something that also has some kind of trailing tether that holds it back to the firer. So harpoons are like this. You fire your harpoon at your great white whale called Moby Dick, if you happen to be whatever his name is, Amos, was that right? Or a taser is a modern day equivalent. So you have something that fires spiky things at somebody, and the spiky things hit the people. I believe they're spiky. And then this is actually these tethers are springy as well, so they can come back, and you can fire electricity through those because you've actually got those wires there. And then the third type of gun is probably substance guns, so things that don't fire individual projectiles but fire something continuously. So water guns are like that. Actually, water pistols tend to fire a little bit of water, but you could classify water cannons as a gun, potentially flamethrowers technically. Plasma guns, they're firing charged particles. And then finally, ray guns, which I don't know of any real ones that exist, but they're hugely popular in science fiction. The idea of a gun that fires a line of something that's continuous and will do some damage to whatever you're shooting at. Probably most guns are to do with damage. Okay, so let's talk about development of guns. So we're going to start. I'm not going to start with the very basics of arquebus, and I'm particularly talking about carryable guns, so handguns. We'll talk about rifles and pistols and things coming up, but we're going to start with muskets. And so muskets looked a bit like this. This is not the earliest type of musket. This is, I can see looking along, this is a matchlock, but I'll explain what I mean by that as we go along. So muskets fire balls, and so they're spherical. They're made as spherical as possible to make them fly as true as possible, because little bits of imperfections on the balls will make the ball wiggle around in the air. And they're barrel loaded, which means they go in the end of the barrel, then get pushed down, and there's probably some, there needs to be some explosive material down before it. Loading the first muskets was quite a laborious process, and there was a lot of work put into making them better. And then the first muskets were hand-fired, which meant that the musketeer who had the musket had to introduce fire to the powder that was going to explode manually. And there was a part of the gun called the pan, where there was some gunpowder which would leak to the gunpowder through a hole that was behind the ball, and that would explode and would spit the ball out forwards. And this was a tricky process because you had to aim at the same time as trying to introduce this fire. It also had the additional problem that this meant that musketeers were carrying around gunpowder and fire, usually in the form of some form of tinderbox, which held smouldering stuff. And I believe the practice was that they would have a belt and they would sling the gunpowder on one hip and the tinderbox on the other hip. But this was obviously a thing that was looking for disaster when you're carrying around both fire and gunpowder at the same time. So there were all sorts of accidents that happened. So the next development was a thing called the matchlock, which was in that earlier picture as well. And you can see very clearly here what this is. So it's a piece of string which is probably treated to make it burn fairly slowly. You have, and this acts like as a fuse. And the trigger here is used to, you pull back on the trigger, which then rotates this simple mechanism and brings that bit of burning string down into the pan, which is just to the right of it, which will then give you your ignition and fire. So this was better because it meant that setting fire to the string and then aiming and firing were separate processes. So it made it easier to aim and then pull the trigger to be able to fire. And the trigger is the mechanism that's been used ever since. And this started out as being a very simple mechanism, as just being able to rotate this bit of stuff. And then the next development after that was the flintlock. And here's a diagram of flintlock, and this is a huge step forwards in gun design because you didn't have to carry your fire around with you anymore. And this is a more complex mechanism, and we've got the pan still, which has the explosive powder that's going to be ignited, gunpowder. But this is now generally kept closed, except for when loading it, and except when firing. And above that, which is on a springy mechanism, so it can spring back and open up, is this thing called the frizzen, which is rough, and is the thing that will be rubbed against by the flint, and the flint's being held in the jaws with the jaw screw, and you got the cock, and you could pull the cock back, and then when you pull the trigger, this shoots the flint forwards quickly. It rubs against the frizzen and comes down into the pan, which is now opened up by pushing against the frizzen by the flint, which then fires the gunpowder in the pan and then does the rest of the reaction to fire the ball out the end. So flintlock was a huge advance, and for hundreds of years, muskets worked on this principle, and other guns developed off this principle. So simple pistols started to become made as well, and this was good. I mean, there were still accidents. The accuracy was not great. The distance they could be fired across wasn't huge, but you could certainly do damage at a distance that was greater than using some kind of pokey stick like a spear. I'm not sure what the range is of these compared with a good longbow, for example, but there were certainly advantages for these guns in all sorts of ways. And over time, the balls shrank down from fairly large balls in early guns with arquebuses to smaller balls. And one of the reasons, a couple of reasons, one is that, of course, a smaller ball can go faster, and then a smaller ball actually has better piercing power. So it's better able to get through chainmail and plate mail and stuff like that. And guns like this were starting to spell the end of the effectiveness of armour. And I'll talk about armour in another series of videos coming up. So where we're going to go from there, we're going to move on to rifles. We often use the term rifle to mean a gun that is held in both hands, and there's a stock that comes up against your shoulder, and you look down the barrel to fire, and it's fairly long. That's not actually what rifling means. There are a couple of things. This isn't the most important part, but rifles need to be breech loaded because the barrel is different. So breech loading means that instead of introducing your projectile at the end of the barrel and letting it slide down and then or pushing it down and then firing it out, it has to be put in the side at the end of the barrel where the explosion's going to happen. That's breech loading. So that's the breech. The important part about rifling is the inside of the barrel, which has grooves created in it. And this is called rifling, which is why a rifle is called a rifle. And you might recognise this as being from the start of every James Bond film ever. And actually that you might not have realised that this spiral thing was actually intended to be the view down the barrel of a gun at somebody, and you get a silhouette at the other end and you shoot at them, and then there's some red which indicates blood. So this is what what is now a bullet is going to go down. The good question is why? Why have we got these spirals? And here's a nice little picture which kind of explains it, but I'll talk about it as well. Because what happens is those grooves make the bullet, which is now a shape that's kind of long and thin like a tube, but with a pointed rounded end, spins whilst it's in the air. And the effect of the spinning is profound. So when you spin things, you might know from spinning tops and gyroscopes and things like that, things that are spinning find it hard to fall over. And this is because of some complicated physics that I'm really not going to go into. So a spinning top likes to stay upright. It doesn't like to be moved sideways. And it likes to do it much more than if it wasn't spinning. Similarly, a bike that's being ridden, the wheels spin, and the wheels spinning gives you stability. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, if you ride a bike, that the slower you go, the harder it is to stay upright. But as you go faster, it becomes easier. And that's because of the same effect. Similarly, if you play any sports with these long, thin balls, like American football or rugby and the various types, if you spin the ball as you throw it, it makes the throw much more accurate because it becomes stable in the air. So this has two effects with a gun. The first is that it actually means that aiming is much more accurate. Muskets, you try to match the size of your musket barrel to the size of your musket ball as closely as possible, of course, because you wanted your explosion to be effective and push as much energy into the ball to power it down the other end, and to keep it as straight as possible as it goes down. But inevitably, they would rattle a bit as they go down, and they could go out in slightly different directions. And then once in the air, they were fairly susceptible to wind and to any defects on the ball to make them not go true. So muskets weren't hugely accurate. And with rifles, suddenly guns had a larger range and were more accurate, and they could fire further because the spinning bullet will go further, because in addition to the effect of being more accurate, they actually tend to fall less and can be fired faster and various other things. So that's what rifling was about. And so rifles were developed. And next I'm going to talk about pistols, which is shortening guns, so they've got a smaller barrel. you could effectively have the same mechanisms for pistols as you had for muskets. So a pistol is generally thought of as being a handgun, so it's shorter and it's a one hand. So something like this. So this is a flintlock pistol, which is still using balls. It's not rifled, but then the same techniques of rifling and stuff would come into pistol guns as well. So the next development to talk about is repeaters. And this is where instead of having to load each bullet separately, you are able to repeatedly fire and only load so often. So you load a few in at a time. And so I've got here, it says some of the energy from the shot moves the next shot into place. And that's true for most repeating guns. We will quickly look at the revolver, which is slightly different. And the idea is that as well as projecting the gun, the bullet forwards, the energy from the explosion also is a small amount of it is diverted to make these mechanics work, to be able to get the next shot into place. So this led to the development of a thing called the cartridge, which is a combination of a bullet plus the thing that's going to explode, plus the casing. So this is necessary to be able to have repeating guns, because otherwise, where are you going to get your explosive from? So the explosive and the bullet have to be basically encapsulated together, and the casing is the thing that puts them together. So here's a fairly classic setup for what's called a cartridge, or a shell for a gun, and we've got various components here. So number one is the bullet, which is the thing at the front. This is held tightly into the casing, but the explosion is going to be enough to fire it out forwards, so it'll be fired. Secondly, we've got the casing, which is the metal that surrounds everything. And then three, we've got the boomy stuff, which could be gunpowder or cordite, or I don't know what else might be available. Number four is the grippy bit. So you've got a ridge here that you can hold on to, and there's two reasons for that. One is that you want to be, when the explosion happens, you want to make sure that the casing doesn't get fired out backwards. But also you need a way of gripping hold of this casing so you can get it out of the way for the next cartridge or shell to be put in place. And then number five at the bottom is a thing called the primer. So this guns often use a hammer mechanism, and the hammer hits this primer from underneath, which somehow causes a spark, which the spark then goes into the boomy bit, which causes the explosion, which then fires the bullet out the front. Okay, so possibly the earliest, I don't actually know. Big caveat, all this stuff I'm saying about guns, I am not the world's biggest expert in guns, and if I say anything that's technically inaccurate or an oversimplification, I do not apologize for oversimplifications. For inaccuracies, I do apologize. But I believe that revolvers were the first repeating guns, or certainly the first dominant repeating guns. And they looked a bit like this. And this there's this revolving thing at the sides that you probably know what these things look like. And you've probably seen films in which people are loading these, and you spin those chambers round and put one bullet in each, and typically they're sometimes called stick shooters, or some of them that have six components. So the thing that's different about these, I believe, is that the mechanism for moving the next shell cartridge into position is done by the trigger rather than by the energy of the explosion. But that rotating cartridge, or whatever it's called, gets moved around one place when you pull the trigger. The next bullet's brought into position, and the hammer that you can see at the top right also gets pulled back and cocked and hits the primer, which fires the bullet out the end. And over time, these were replaced by more complex and possibly better mechanisms. You could say that revolvers are semi-automatic, because I believe the definition of a semi-automatic is that it has automatic loading, but you have to pull the trigger for every shot. And the different the expansion from this is the fully automatic gun, which is one where you can pull the trigger and it keeps shooting. So as long as the trigger's held, there will obviously be a delay as it gets the next bullet into position, but it will be able to do this faster than you could probably pull the trigger multiple times, so you get a stream of bullets one after another, and this carries on until your ammo runs out, however your ammo is stored. So here's a picture of a World War II machine gun, which is a name that was used for automatic weapons, and this is a longer gun, and it's got a stand. It's meant for lying down and propping up on the ground, and these bullets are fed in some kind of chain mechanism on the side, and then the casings are spat out as it fires through them. Often nowadays, automatic guns have two modes, so you can have them in semi-automatic mode or an automatic mode, which is kind of useful. Special mention, I just want to also talk about shotguns, which is sometimes conceived as being a favourite weapon for farmers and people like that. I think the truth is that there are two really useful aspects of shotguns. One is that they're good for people who are not very skilled at guns, because you don't need a lot of skill at aiming. They don't have the same range as rifles, for reasons that will become obvious. And the other thing is they're really useful guns for video games, because they're short-range, low-accuracy guns, which kind of can mix up the combat styles. So the basic principle is that instead of having one thing that's been fired out, one bullet, you have lots of little things, and shotgun shot is generally a lot of little pellets. Again, you've similarly got a cartridge that goes into position, and they're then projected out. So they have a kind of spray cone effect. They don't spread out necessarily huge amounts, depending on the gun. I guess if you use a sawn-off, then they will spread out more. And they're a low distance, say low accuracy, but they need less accuracy because they're actually doing a cone of effect rather than a single bullet. Okay, so I haven't mentioned the proliferation of lots of different types of guns that are available. So very quick mentions of chain guns, which are guns that they're machine guns that use a chain mechanism for feeding the next bullet in, rather than diverting some of the energy from the explosion. So they need an external source of rotation to rotate the mechanism. Cannons and large guns I haven't got into, mostly not because they're not relevant to video games, but mostly because I've been focusing on personal weapons. Obviously, there's a huge range of these things as well, and the history of cannons and the development of those types of guns is also quite interesting, all the way to large gun emplacements in World War II and modern large guns with shells, with explosive shells that can be fired over long distances. Rail guns, which are guns that technically don't have a barrel as such. They have two or more rails that things are fired down. Coil guns, which instead of using an explosion, use magnetic coils to fire metallic and presumably magnetic ammunition. Air or gas guns, so guns that use compressed air for your explosion rather than some kind of explosive material, and many, many, many more. And I'm not claiming any kind of comprehensiveness. I am claiming that I've maybe looked at the majority of guns that are available. So I think one last thing that I want to say is that I'm a great fan of guns in video games. I'm not a great fan of guns in real life. I think that one of the brilliant things about video games is that it gives you the opportunity to do things that you wouldn't normally get to do in real life. I like many things about the fact that I live in the UK, One of those many things is the fact that the majority of people do not have guns. Even the majority of criminals do not have guns. And therefore, the chances of getting shot by a gun are very, very small in our country. If you want to murder somebody, not that I am in any way advocating murder, of course, yes. Often the choice of weapon is different because the availability of guns is so low in our country. Anyway, enough of preaching. That's it from me for now.